Welcome to TennaTalk, a journey of discovery about all things antenna. TennaTalk is a production of the Antenna Whisperer. That's me, Rudy Wiedemann, K7RAW, and it is generously supported and sponsored by the Las Vegas Radio Amateur Club. This is podcast number 5 Alpha, Mastering NANOVNA Basic Concepts, where we'll go over the basic ideas of how analyzers and NANOVNAs work, what they can do, what they can't do, and how to use them. So the agenda for this podcast will start off with looking at conventional antenna analyzers versus the NANOVNA family of analyzers. And then we'll do a little comparison between the NANOVNAs, and we'll unbox a typical NANOVNA kit to see what's in it and what you can do with it. We'll take a quick look at some PC software that's available to augment and enhance the NANOVNA's capabilities. From there, we'll take a quick peek at the firmware updates and how to upload touchstone files. That's your S1P and S2P files. You'll find out more about that in a minute. Then we'll do NANOVNA capabilities, and then we'll do a tour of the display format, after which we'll do a tour of the NANOVNA menu, and I'll walk you through the actual menu of a typical NANOVNA. And then we'll do the calibration procedure, followed by useful accessories, and finally tips and tricks. So with that, let's get going. So for many years, MFJ had the 259 Bravo and subsequent very similar meters of the same family. And they would allow you to select a frequency range and manually sweep the frequency and look at the SWR and look at the ohms. And that would give you, as you notice up on top, you'll see in the display. All right, so you see here in this display, you've got the frequency, you've got the SWR at that frequency, you've got the actual radiation resistance, and then the reactance X in also in ohms, but it'll be like a JX, that's your J value. And you had to basically sweep through that to find all your minima. Not terribly cheap, $250 to $350, but they worked pretty well, and they were the best thing available for a long time. And I owned one for a long time, and it helped me out a lot. But with the advent of the NANOVNA, I quickly came to realize that it was a little bit like a two-blade pocket knife for Boy Scouts. It was pretty limited in what it could do. It's pretty nice, useful, but limited. Some people like devices like this, which is a Rig Expert. There's a family of them available from $300 to $1,200. Many of them will give you sweep information, lots of other information, and that has been out for a number of years. One of the advantages of the Rig Expert is it is somewhat more visible in bright sunlight, especially if you get the kind with the black and white LCD style as opposed to the color LCD LED, because it'll have much better contrast in bright sunlight. But that's probably one of the main advantages of the Rig Expert, but it is kind of pricey. So then, of course, came the NANOVNA, and now you're at a whole different price point, $50 to $150, with a whole lot going on at the same time over a programmable frequency scan of multiple plots from Smith chart to SWR, the log mag impedance, or I should say losses over frequency, things like phase, whole bunch of stuff we'll see here in a minute. So this is where the game has really changed. Now we've got something that looks a lot more like this super duper Swiss Army knife that can do a whole bunch of things. There are a number of flavors of NANOVNA. Some of the earlier ones were these open frame sandwich style, which are still okay. They're very good entry models. You can get those for about $40, $50. And they can work just fine. Some of the earlier versions of the fully enclosed versions had this wheel that you move back and forth to select, and then you push it in to choose to set something like a flag or a trace point. This one is the NANOVNA-N. This has, or H, I don't remember which one. Anyway, it has N connectors on it, and one of the early ones with the bigger display. And then, of course, my favorite is the -F V2, which we'll find out more about here in a moment. It has the larger display, it has a higher resolution, has a bigger battery, and more data points it can handle. So let's take a closer look. So of those four, we had the open frame, the early version with the rocker wheel, the SAA2N, and the NanoVNA. And you can see that the -F V2 has the bigger screen with the higher resolution. And this actually is 301 points. It's just been updated with the new firmware 0.5.0. And has SMA connectors, and if you're reasonably careful with them, they'll last for a long time. We've got tricks on how to help you with that too. And it is in a full aluminum case. So that's what we're going to look at more closely today, and that's what I own, that's what I prefer. So of the F, V2, there are two versions. There's an earlier version. Be careful. It really is meant for up to version 1.5, 0.1.5, with only 101 data points and no ability to store touchstone files, which are the S1P and S2P files. The 3 gigahertz and at around $140, $150 with a version 0.5.0 from SysJoint gives you 301 data point capability and does full storage. The Chrome browser will not be able to download the firmware. You need to use a different browser, and then make the default to Chinese if you have to. You may see those on some of them come up as Chinese, and you have to switch it to English manually in the config menu, and I'll show you where that's at in a minute. But anyway, so that's the -F version that I like the most. So what's in it? Okay, so you get the NanoVNA, and you get a couple of these male-to-male patch cables, about 6 inches long each, for doing connections to filters and other through devices. You want to measure from the port 1 going out into port 2 going in and see what's coming through that path. You get a little chip here for being used as a stylus, but I use my thumbnail, works just as well. You get a USB to USB 3. I think it's USB 3 or USB-C, I don't recall. Anyhow, it's the USB-C. And then you get some adapters. And these, we'll find out more in a moment, but these are for the calibration. It's an open, a short, and a 50 ohm load exactly. There are two popular PC software application packages, NanoVNA Saver and NanoVNA QT. I've had more success with the Saver than QT, quite honestly. QT can crash on you depending on what version of Windows you have. And there are versions for other operating systems such as Mac and Linux. But I prefer Saver, and it seems to work pretty well, except Saver seems to only want to capture 101 data points at a time, and you have to capture different ranges of frequencies to capture multiple files to get the number of data points and the resolution that you want. That's probably the only downside, and I hope they fix that in the future. The two main suppliers of the firmware are SysJoint, which is my favorite because they keep it up to date. The latest version is 0.5.0, and No Electric. And you can learn more about NanoVNA firmware and such and the history of them from nanovna.com and nanorfe.com. But if you do a firmware download, remember to do a reset and recalibrate after every firmware update to clear the settings and have it ready to go. So how do you do the firmware update and scan capture files? Well, it's pretty easy. For the updates, what you do is you hold down the center button, either the wheel or the center button on the right. There'll be three buttons. One's up, one's down, one's center, select. You'll hold down the center one while powering up. A U-disk should appear on your Windows desktop. Do not repair it. Do not accept a repair. Just pass it through and accept it the way it is and just open it. Then you can drag and drop your new update.bin file that you've downloaded from sysjoint or wherever into the drive root directory right on top, right where it comes up. And then reboot the NanoVNA. It'll update itself and you can see the new version on the splash screen. For scanning capture files and uploading them, all right, once you have your scan, you just go to the storage, which I'll show you in a minute, and you click on S1P under the storage menu. That will capture it into the NanoVNA. It'll take a snapshot of your scan. Then you bring up the U-disk drive as above. You open up the file folder, and you'll see the files starting at 001 all the way to 00 whatever, .S1P or S2P, depending on what type of file you captured. And you drag and drop all the captured files to your desktop. And it's as simple as that. So, what can you do with a NanoVNA? Well, a whole bunch of things, as it turns out. Well, obviously you can do an SWR scan within a frequency range. That's going to be probably 90% of what you're going to use it for. But if you move the marker around with the up-down buttons, it'll be a little triangle. You will see whether you've got your Smith chart set up in R plus L or C or R plus JX at the marker. It'll give you the actual Smith value, your impedance at that frequency, which could be very useful. It'll also give you L and C tuning solutions at the marker so that you actually can breadboard that and actually try it for yourself. You can test balance on uns and chokes. You can check the tuning range of your ATU. You can measure inductor and capacitor values pretty well. You can do a Smith chart plot versus the frequency, of course. That's what you'll usually see. The circular squiggles we'll show you here in a minute. We talked about storing S1P and S2P files for the SimSmith import, where you would bring them into your PC like I just showed you and drag and drop them into SimSmith, as you saw for Bravo. And S1P is the normal SWR reflected versus transmitted signal, okay, scan, and S2P is a through scan from port 1 to port 2 of a device like a choke or a balun that you're measuring the through characteristics of as opposed to reflection characteristics. Beyond that, you can do resonance circuit plots using the phase plot, and you can actually see where it flips phase at the resonance point. You can do signal line delay. You can check filter frequency response, phase angles, Q factors to see how sharp or how wide a bandwidth your antenna has. Feed line length, feed line loss scan over frequency, and feed line shorts and open detection. So, and there are a few other trickier things that you can do, but we won't go into them here. That's already quite a bit to swallow, and I hope you can get to the first 3 or 4. So when you bring up your NanoVNA -FV2, this is what you'll see. Don't get too shook. There's a whole heck of a lot going on. But it's color-coded, so here in yellow is log mag. I like to leave the yellow trace as SWR, the green trace is the Smith chart, and use the light blue, kind of a cyan, for log mag. Log mag is your pass-through response, and you can often just turn that off and just have SWR and Smith chart. Now you'll see that these are multiple tags that you can move around with the up-down buttons that are over here. And if you click on tag number 4, you'll see that's right in the center of the Smith chart. Look, it's 48 dB, and You got a number of interesting things. Log mag will come out in dB, of course, but very often you'll see the Smith chart plotted out with lots of circles here, and then as you move the trace tag along the different frequency places, it'll actually read out the actual resistance and reactance. And here's the resistance reactance at our green tag right there in the middle. So it's very close to 50 ohms, which will be almost exactly an SWR of 1.0. So over here on the right, you'll see the vertical plot or the scale from 0 dB to negative dB, which are losses, of course, and log mag is a loss of signal. It's the attenuation over frequency that it's plotting here in the light blue. And the yellow is a different log mag plot that we can set up with a different scale. But there's lots of different things you can do. Most of the time, you're going to have something like a 1 to 10 SWR in yellow here, following a yellow plot of your SWR here. So that's what you'll typically have. So now let's take a quick look at the menu map. All right, so this is your main top menu. The first thing you'll want to do is go to the config page, and that will bring you down here. And one of the first things you want to do is set the sweep points to maximum. On the -FV2, you can set to 301 data points to get the maximum resolution. Default brightness is also 80%. I would set that to 100% right off the bat. I wouldn't worry about the rest unless the language came up as Chinese, in which case I'd switch it to English. So that's where you'd find that to do that first thing. The next thing I would do is I would set my display. And from there, I've got the traces. I've got 4 traces, 0 through 3 of these 4 colors that it comes up with. And you can activate them or deactivate them. The format of each trace, whichever one you've actually selected here on the trace and highlighted with a little, there'll be a little checkbox over here, will be the one that the format will apply to, and you can set it up to SWR for trace 0 in yellow, and Smith with R plus JX reactance for green. That's pretty common. That's very often the default. So you can set the scale, the right-hand scale, and that's 0 to 1 in proportion to its default. So if you had a 0 or a 1 to 10 SWR scale, and you change this scale number to 0.5, then it'll go from 1 to 5, which is 0.5 of 10, half of 10. So that's how that works. Channel will select whether you're talking S1P or S2P, and that's very important when you're doing log mag type through measurements. The next thing you would do is set your stimulus range. And you start with a range that's wider, and I like to use 3 to 30 megahertz for the entire HF band by default, and then I would calibrate to that. And remember, you want to calibrate very often either at the rig end of your coax, or if you want to really see what's going on at the antenna and it kind of dial out all of the stuff in between your rig and the antenna, you can do that by placing the calibration devices at the antenna end of your coax. And that's called calibrating at the calibration plane at the antenna as opposed to at the rig. So it essentially virtually puts the NANOVNA as though it thinks it's up there at your antenna. Then I would do that calibration. Very often I'll do the reset of the calibration. Okay, so let's take a look at the calibration. You reset and then you go to calibrate. When you calibrate, it'll ask you to place an open on the contact or connector, the SMA on port 1, and then you remove that and you apply the short, and you press the short button, then you take that off and you apply the load, little load device, you screw that on, press load. And if you're doing through calibrations for log mag, you also put your cable, just a short cable, that one of the ones they provide you from port 1 to port 2, click on through, Click Done, and after that you can select which slot of your storage slots, your calibration storage slots, presets, you can save it to, because then later on you can recall those without having to recalibrate. But if in doubt, and we'll see how to check it, how to sanity check if you've got a good calibration, you can do a recall, do a quick sanity check, and if it sanity checks, you're fine, don't have to recalibrate. Given that you're in the frequency range that that particular storage slot was set for, and it'll tell you generally what frequency range it was calibrated to. So then, once I'm calibrated, then I look and see the frequency subrange of interest. Like if I was looking at 20 meters, my antenna might not be resonant in the 20-meter band at all. So if I've scanned from 3 to 30, I should be able to find it, hopefully, somewhere in that frequency range. And if I'm either high or low outside the 20-meter band, I'll know it. And then I can make a quick course adjustment. And then I'll change the stimulus and move the stimulus down from the start to stop. Let's see, let's follow this down. Start and stop. I like to use start and stop. It's easier to figure this out. Start frequency, and then you just enter like 3 megahertz. Stop frequency, 30 megahertz. And that sets the frequency range for course. And then once I've got the antenna dialed into the 20-meter band, then I might set the start frequency to 13 and stop frequency to 15 megahertz for the 20-meter band to zero in pretty nicely, and spread all those nice 301 data points across the entire curve. So that is just a quick tour of the menu map of how to drive around. There are other things that you can play with. There'll be search functions that you can actually do a trace. Okay, you can set your markers and move it up and down, but you can also have it tracking. If you turn on search, then it will actually search for either a maximum, a minimum, so it'll search left or search right for the next max or min that you set, or if you hit tracking, it'll actually track on the minimum across the entire scale, look for its absolute minimum across the entire stimulus frequency range, and then it'll keep the marker there as you tune your antenna. It'll move and show it to you on your little tracking tag with the frequency and the SWR for the SWR tag. And if you've got the Smith chart running, then it'll show you the Smith chart tag as well at the R and the JX value at that frequency. Pretty handy. So let's move on. So we were talking about calibration, and here we see the Smith value is 894. Don't worry about the negative right now. We're measuring it at the S11, which is the port 1. And then it's reading out here in L and C as opposed to reactance value. So it's the equivalent of a 14.7 picofarad, which is very, very slightly below the equator here, essentially negligible. And so when you've got an open here, okay, and you want to place, you don't want to just leave the port open, you want to place the open cap because you want to dial out the capacitive effect of the cap itself. So you put the cap on, that's got no connection inside, no pin, no nothing, and you should, after calibration, you should see this. Now this is, we're going to show you 3 slides after it's all been calibrated, not during calibration, but after calibration. So this is the open, because remember, the center of the Smith chart was 50 ohms. Over here, it goes down in resistance to a short. Up here to the right of 50 ohms, it rapidly and logarithmically goes up in resistance until it's an open. So at the 3 o'clock position, it's an open. We put a short here. We apply a short cap on here, and we should see a perfect short. And when we apply the load, you should see the 50 ohm load dead center. And look, 51.2. close enough for government work. So that's what you're looking for whenever you're doing a calibration or recalling a calibration for your frequency range, which will be down here from the start to the stop frequency. And you'll see an OLST, okay? That means open, short, load, and if you calibrate it for through, then you'll also see a T, and then you'll see a little C star that says been calibrated at that frequency range. So you should see that if you do a recall or a fresh calibration. So this is the way to sanity check if you've got a good calibration and a well-operating Nano VNA. If you don't see that, either you're doing something wrong or you have a problem with your Nano. Now, one of the tricks that I've come up with, which is pretty handy, is a 3-position switch to do the open, short, and load just by flipping a switch without having to change anything. So very often I'll put this at the calibration plane at the antenna end of my coax, either using an SMA, a BNC, or an SO239 type connector. And this switch is a center off or center open, and then when the toggle is moved to the left, it actually swings the little arm and connects the center to the right. Think of this as a seesaw. That's the easiest way to think of it, as a seesaw. That's how these switches work inside. So that you're now connecting one end of the precision 50 ohm 1% resistor to the center tap of your connector here. And excuse me, not the center tap, the outside ground. The center tap is actually soldered to the center connector, and then the switch will connect it to either this side or that side. So in this case, you've got a short, and again, the seesaw effect would connect our center to the left contact here, and that then would go to the ground part. And this, of course, is soldered to the center pin of the BNC. This is soldered to the center pin of the SO239. A little bit of a blob there. So these are really, really handy to do quick calibration and a quick sanity check of your calibration. And so I would encourage you to take a look at using something like this. Some useful accessories. You can get one of these really cool little boards that's a demo board with some filters and some different devices that will give you Smith chart plots of different types and different attenuators down here. And it actually uses these U.FL connectors, which are really tiny. They're the size of a match head. And you snap them onto these little connectors very carefully. You just snap them down almost like a button snap on pants. And on the other end, you've got an SMA male connector that goes up here to your Nano VNA. The other thing you can get is one of these little prototype boards that you can use for prototyping oscillators and filters and all kinds of very interesting things. Here's a filter that we're looking at the frequency response of the log mag frequency response in negative dB off of perfect. If you calibrate it, it should be flat at 0. If you have your little jumper cable here, when you calibrate it, it should be flat. And then when you add a device in between, like a filter from over here, then you should see a curve like that. Now, you can't have enough adapters. I'm sorry. I guarantee you, if you get some adapters and you're not careful, you will always end up in the field with the wrong one. So you'll have to kind of make do with that. So there are adapter kits out there, and they're not all that expensive. You can buy a whole set for like 50, 60 bucks. And you can never have enough adapters, let's just put it that way. So it's pretty helpful. So wrapping up, let's talk a little bit about Nano VNA tips and tricks. I like to install a sacrificial SMA male to SMA female adapter onto my S1P port, at least. And that way, when I screw stuff onto it, and if I eventually start wearing out that thread, or I munge it up by accident, I can simply unthread it and thread on a new one onto virtually virgin connector that's on the NANOVNA itself. And I'm not messing up with my NANOVNA connector threads. So that's a very helpful thing. Always remember to set the maximum number of data points available in the -FV2. It's 301 for the latest version of the firmware. I like to start with a stimulus range of 3 to 30, the full HF range, which is typical. We talked a little bit about the three-way switch for calibration. And then you want to reset and calibrate, or you can do a recall of the stored calibration. But I would always recommend that you sanity check the calibration and the stored calibration that you recalled with your three-way switch to make sure it looked like you saw earlier with the 3 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and center position of your Smith plot. Remember, you want to consider calibrating at the antenna plane, and that emulates the Nano as though it were at the antenna itself. Start with a broad frequency range, see what's going on, and then zoom in on the frequency of interest and the SWR range of interest on the vertical scale for better resolution. And then finally, capture that S1P scan file and import it into SimSmith for analysis. Once you got it on your desktop and your PC, you literally drag and drop it into the file box there at the bottom of the table under the load block on the far upper left-hand corner of SimSmith. On the bottom entry of the table will be a thing called File, and that's where you drag and drop it. It should turn green as you hover over the top of it. That's when you drop it, and suddenly your plot will magically appear in SimSmith, and now you're ready to do all kinds of analysis with it. So, hopefully that gave you a flavor of the NANOVNA, and you should be ready for a live demo, which is the next podcast, the companion podcast to this podcast, coming up soon, to be posted soon on YouTube. So if you like this video, please click the like button. That helps with the algorithm. Click the bell notification and subscribe to be notified of future videos. And I hope to see you here soon, and I hope you're enjoying this series of videos, and I hope you're looking forward to lots more videos like this that I have planned for the future. So 73, and have a great day. Bye-bye.